Hello, ladies and gentlemen of On the Line. I'm your host, Jen Gerson, and today we're going to be speaking to economics professor and founding director of McGill University's Max Bell School of Public Policy, Chris Ragan. We're going to talk about a story that has been absolutely buried under an avalanche of news of late. The threatened indictment of U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell. Last week, Powell put out a statement flatly stating that the Trump administration is abusing the courts in order to put pressure on the independence of the Fed. What exactly does that mean? Why does it matter? What will the implications be for Canada and its economy? We get right into it today on The Line.
Good evening. On Friday, the Department of Justice served the Federal Reserve with grand jury subpoenas, threatening a criminal indictment related to my testimony before the Senate Banking Committee last June. That testimony concerned, in part, a multi-year project to renovate historic Federal Reserve office buildings. I have deep respect for the rule of law and for accountability in our democracy. No one, certainly not the chair of the Federal Reserve, is above the law. But this unprecedented action should be seen in the broader context of the administration's threats and ongoing pressure. This new threat is not about my testimony last June or about the renovation of the Federal Reserve buildings. It is not about Congress's oversight role. The Fed, through testimony and other public disclosures, made every effort to keep Congress informed about the renovation project. Those are pretexts. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation. I have served at the Federal Reserve under 4 administrations, Republicans and Democrats alike. In every case, I have carried out my duties without political fear or favor, focused solely on our mandate of price stability and maximum employment. Public service sometimes requires standing firm in the face of threats. I will continue to do the job the Senate confirmed me to do, with integrity and a commitment to serving the American people. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me this morning. Chris Ragan, you are joining us from Montreal, I believe?
Montreal.
Montreal?
Montreal's West Island, yeah.
Fantastic. And how is the weather there in Montreal right now?
It was snowing this morning on my morning walk, but the sun has now come out and the snow has stopped. But it's still white and crisp and quite lovely, actually.
Oh, well, I would be jealous, but not only is it lovely and crisp, but it's also warm here, so haha. I am your host, Jen Gerson, for On the Line, as you were aware, and you are joining me today because I wanted to talk about a news story that I think is not getting anywhere near enough attention in the United States. Everyone is very hyperfixated on what's happening in Greenland with ICE protesters, shootings in the United States, what's happened with Venezuela. All of these are massive stories, but I think this one is just as massive, and that is it appears that the Department of Justice in the United States is now investigating and threatening to criminally indict Jerome Powell over his Senate testimony about building renovations. Powell is, I believe, the head of the Federal Reserve, and that is going to have very significant not only political implications, not only is it a very ominous warning sign about politics in America, but that has broader economic implications, I think, both for America and potentially for Canada as well. So, of course, Chris Ragan, you are an economics expert. You know about this stuff. You know more than I could possibly ever know about this. So I'm hoping that you might be able to just inform me about the basics, and then we can get into the deeper implications of some of this stuff as well. But for people who may not be aware, can you explain a little bit about who Powell is and what role he plays in the American financial and political system?
Yeah. Jerome Powell, sometimes called Jay Powell, is the chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. So he is the head of the U.S. Central Bank. So the equivalent in Canada is the governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem. The equivalent in the UK is the governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey. Right? So he is, now the central banks are not identical by any means, but he is basically the person in charge of and his people around him in charge of U.S. monetary policy, which means when they raise interest rates because they're trying to slow down the U.S. economy and prevent inflation, that's him. Or when they lower interest rates because they're trying to speed up a slumping economy, that's him. So that's why he is ordinarily that's why he is in the news. And when the Fed makes interest rate decisions, it is a front page story, at least on the business pages. And the same is true in Canada and Europe and the UK and other countries, most of whom have their own central banks.
So the reason why this has come up is because the criminal indictment that has been threatened against Powell, I think the general consensus appears to be that it is politically motivated. There doesn't seem to be any indication that Powell is engaged in any criminal activity with regard to office building renovations. And he has now come out and issued a very straightforward statement that says that this is Donald Trump trying to interfere with interest rate, using a criminal indictment to interfere with interest rate decisions. Donald Trump is obviously not a fan of higher interest rates, and I think there is pressure being put on him to try and lower interest rates. Is that my read of the situation was correct?
Yeah, there's a context to this. So Jay Powell came in as the head of the Federal Reserve, appointed in fact by Trump in I think it was 2018. And I believe it's a 7-year term, or it might be 2 4-year terms. I'm not quite sure. But he was appointed by Trump in the first term. But it's been now at least a year or more that Donald Trump has been basically picking fights. In Twitter, in Twitter or X or Truth or whatever his social media platform is, but, saying bad things about Jerome Powell, saying he's stupid, saying that he doesn't know how to do monetary policy. This is remarkable stuff. This is remarkable for a democratically elected leader in the United States or in any other country to be slagging the head of your central bank. It's a very bizarre thing. And then, of course, we see these indictments. And like you, I mean, I'm not a legal expert by any means. I don't know what Jerome Powell is guilty of, but everything I've read suggested that this is all pretense or pretext, I suppose, and it's really just Donald Trump escalating his fight against Jerome Powell, which is kind of funny because Jerome Powell is going to come to the end of his term this year, I think within the next 6 months. So you kind of think, well, if Donald Trump wants, new monetary policy, just wait 6 months. You'll appoint the next one. If you wanted to appoint some lackey, some yes man, I guess you could do it. It has to be, I think, Senate confirmed. But in this day and age, you'd probably get it Senate confirmed. So it's a little weird, but most things that Donald Trump does these days are kind of weird. So that is what's going on, is that he is effectively threatening Jerome Powell. And it was quite remarkable that Jerome Powell finally found it necessary to issue that video, which is really quite remarkable, right? Saying that there are these charges or these indictments, and this is just a pretext, for basically the White House intimidating the Federal Reserve into monetary policy direction. So this is now the White House effectively politicizing monetary policy. And this is the big issue. You can think about this as a big political issue, but as an economist, I think about this as an enormous economic issue. So that's, I think, where you probably want to go in terms of this conversation about why do we have central bank independence, and what does central bank independence mean, and why do we care so much?
You literally anticipated my next question, and that is, even should we have central bank independence? Let's play with that theory a little bit. Why did we come into this idea that the central bank, the guys who set our interest rates, which dictate how much money we can borrow and at what rates, why is it that they should be politically independent? Why can't we have our politicians basically have a say in that?
So the answer is that it took many years and many countries to learn the lesson that when you didn't have central bank independence, what happened is that we got politicians elected, nonetheless, right? Elected politicians, but nonetheless, politicians basically influencing monetary policy. And politicians generally want to influence monetary policy in one direction, right? Donald Trump says high interest rates are a bad idea, low interest rates are great. And this is the direction that politicians, when they have the ability to influence monetary policy, they push it for lower interest rates. They want to goose the economy, maybe before an election so that they can hopefully win the election. And so they are taking the short-term bias, which is, well, let's have lower interest rates. Let's be stimulative to the economy. And that's a better thing. And that's in, the public interest. And over time, you get that short run effect. But over time, what happens with central banks that lower interest rates when they shouldn't is that you stimulate the economy in the short run, but in the longer run, and that means 3 or 4 or 5 years, what you end up with is not a stimulated economy in any real sense, but you end up with higher inflation. And so when central banks have not been operationally independent, there has been an inflationary bias. And it took us, policymakers, central bankers, governments, economists, a lot of years and a lot of countries' experience to put that together and to realize, what we really need, if we don't like inflation, and I think we've all been reminded in the last 2 or 3 years why we don't like inflation. But if we really don't like inflation and we really want to keep inflation low, then what we need is a central bank that is operationally independent. Now, here's the hard part. You get a central bank that is given a mandate to keep inflation low and stable, and that's exactly what the Bank of Canada, for example, is given as a mandate. The Federal Reserve's mandate is a little bit more complicated. They have what's called a dual mandate. They're trying to keep low and stable inflation and maximum employment. But most of the central banks that have adopted inflation targeting over the last 35 years, and Canada was the second country to do so after New Zealand. But most of these central banks have a target of, typically 2% inflation. Their goal is to keep inflation at target, typically 2%, low and stable and predictable. And the hard part is to say, okay, how do you keep the central bank to be operationally independent so you keep the politicians out of it, but at the same time have this institution be answerable to the government and to the people, because you don't want these institutions to be unaccountable. So how do you do both, right? How do you say, well, we want the benefits of a central bank that really focuses on inflation and doesn't get politicized. We want those benefits, but we also want to make sure that they are accountable to the people, because you don't just want it as a completely independent organization. And Canada, if you want to talk a bit about Canada's method, we have actually struck a balance in there that is actually quite good.
Well, maybe we'll talk about the Canadian method because it may prove to be a model for when America rebuilds from the coming collapse. No, not quite that grim. But so I just wanted to ask a quick question about inflation. That's okay. So we know that over time, if you artificially keep inflation rates too low, you get inflation. Is the reason why
interest rates too low?
Apologies.
Yeah.
If you artificially keep interest rates too low, so interest rates below what the broader economy can bear, over time you will get inflationary pressures. And I presume that's because with really low interest rates, people borrow lots and lots and lots of money. So effectively what's happening is you're increasing the money supply. Is that more or less how that works?
So central banks don't often talk about money supply these days. They tend to prefer to communicate their policy in terms of interest rates. But in fact, that's what's going on. So a central bank that is going to lower the interest rate, the way they lower the interest rates is by injecting money into the economy. So think about this as an increase in the money supply or a reduction in interest rates. They are the opposite sides of the same coin. Okay.
Right. Okay.
But the way central banks usually, except during bizarre periods like COVID and the financial crisis, during normal periods, central banks communicate their policies by talking about interest rate reductions or interest rate increases. But behind the scenes, the money supply is changing. And as you said, if a central bank is going to lower interest rates, what you get in the short run, the reason why they're doing that is to stimulate aggregate demand. So we lower interest rates so that you will go out there and borrow money to buy a car. Somebody else is going to borrow money to buy a house. A company is going to borrow money to expand their facilities. So the interest rate goes down, borrowing picks up in the economy. That borrowing is financing spending in the economy. So spending picks up in the economy. And the short run, what you get, like over a period of 1 or 2 or 3 years, what you get is a boom. You get, output is investments going up, output's going up, employment's going up. This is looking pretty great. Okay. And that's what Donald Trump wants. That's what any politician who has politicized monetary policy in the past wants. They want the boost in economic activity, especially if it's just before an election, right? But here's the problem.
It's the equivalent of financing your home renovation on debt that you can't then support with your income.
Yeah.
Right.
But here's the problem. And here's what, you have to study economics and study monetary policy for a while before you realize this. But the hard part about understanding monetary policy is that the effects you get in the economy over a period of 1 or 2 or 3 years get completely unwound over 4 and 5 and 6 years and beyond. So what in the short run is a boost to the economy, output, employment, investment, etc. In the long run, it all gets unwound, but the effect, the sustained impact of that monetary policy is higher inflation.
So it seems to me like
you don't get long run impacts on employment or output, but you get long run impacts on inflation. So it's kind of a short run gain, right? The boost in the economy, and the long run pain, which is inflation. And so the central bank, the operationally independent central bank, says, we don't want that inflation. That inflation is very costly. We learned that in the 60s and the 70s in particular. We want to keep inflation low. So we don't want to goose the economy. We want to keep inflation low and stable. Sorry, I cut you off.
That's okay. I apologize. I'm normally the one who's cutting out everybody else off, but I'm working on being better at that. So it seems to me like with the 2% target just seems to be that beautiful spot where you're kind of riding the edge of the bubble, the bubble of an economy, where you're like saying, hey, we do want growth, but we don't want full bubble growth. So 2% is just the right. It's not too hot. It's not too cold. That's why we picked that target.
Yeah, there's a reasonably geeky debate among economists about there's not much of a debate about whether inflation targeting is a good or a bad idea. There's a lot of support for inflation targeting, but there is a bit of a geeky debate about, okay, if we're going to target inflation, should it be 2%? Should it be 1%? Should it be 0? Should it be 3? And I think the answer is, if you go back to the early 90s when New Zealand started inflation targeting, we started inflation targeting, then a bunch of other countries kind of jumped on that inflation targeting bandwagon. Most of them, by far, chose 2%. And I think the reason really is that 2% was low enough to be almost ignored. I mean, it's not quite, you can't completely ignore 2% inflation. It's still eroding the value of your money at 2% a year. But it's nothing like 6 or 8 or 12 or 13, which is what we had in the mid 70s. Okay. And 2% is low enough to be ignored. Also, there were some technical reasons as to why achieving 0% inflation was actually very difficult. And so the central bank sort of landed on 2% as, if we can keep inflation, pretty close to 2%, they can't keep it exactly at 2%. There's all kinds of shocks, supply side, demand side shocks that push inflation up and down around 2%. But it's actually pretty amazing. From 1995 to just before COVID, the average rate of inflation in Canada was almost exactly 2%, like 2.0 and then a second decimal place. Okay.
And do economists get excited when that happens? Is it like,
look at me,
we nailed
look
it?
Look at me. Look at how excited I am just talking about it. No, they do. They absolutely do. Especially after we had gone through the 70s and 80s, where inflation was bouncing around. Okay. Up to 12, down to 6, up to 13, down again to 4%. And you think, oh my God, let's get out of that world. I mean, I could show you a graph, if I could do it here, of inflation rate over the last 60 years. And the 70s and 80s are this high and volatile period. And then there's the inflation targeting period is very low and bumping around pretty stable. And that is, central banks have kind of come to the realization that the best contribution they can make to our overall economic performance is to keep inflation low and stable. Okay. And sorry, because
oh no, sorry, I didn't mean to. You finish that thought.
Well, just to keep inflation low and stable. And frankly, I think it probably matters not so much whether it's 1 or 2 or 3. You could get into that geeky conversation. But low and stable and predictable is how most central banks think they can make the biggest contribution. Not by goosing the economy all the time, right? I mean, goosing the economy if it's slumping, slamming on the brakes when it's overheating, but you try to kind of basically keep inflation, and all of that is designed to keep inflation close to its target.
Okay, so here's my really dumb question. What if the central bank or any central bank were to say, okay, we're going to set the we're going to set the interest rate, which is different from the inflation rate. We're going to set the interest rate really low to goose the economy and get that borrowing effect going. But at the same time, is it possible for them to do that while at the same time restricting the monetary supply?
Nope.
Or does that not make any kind of sense? Okay, right. Okay, because that's how they can split.
And here's why. Because behind the scenes, the central bank really only has one instrument. Okay. Mm-hmm. So you can call that instrument the interest rate, or you can call that instrument the money supply, but they're connected behind the scenes.
Okay.
So the central bank really only has one thing. So what do you want it to do? Do you want it to be expansionary and kind of goose the economy, or do you want it to be contractionary and slow down the economy? But they can't tighten over here and loosen over here. Like they just don't have two instruments. Fiscal policy has lots of instruments. Fiscal policy has this tax over here, that tax over there. This, I can subsidize that industry and I can tax this industry. I don't think you should, but they can, right? But fiscal policy has way more tools at its disposal. Monetary policy has one. And it's, when you're inside a central bank, they think about it as the balance sheet of the central bank, okay? You call it the balance sheet, call it the money supply, call it the interest rate. There are different sort of ways to really be talking about the same thing, but there's only one instrument.
And so it's safe to say that even if there's not influence, or that the central bank or a central bank is independent, there's still collaboration, because you have a government that's managing those fiscal policies, and the central bank is going to respond to and maybe have some input into those fiscal policies. Is that safe to say?
I would not say that. I would say that the central bank does not have input. So here's how this works in Canada. Okay. The Bank of Canada is a crown corporation. It is wholly owned by the government of Canada. Okay. But it is operationally independent. So every 5 years, the government of Canada and the Bank of Canada make an agreement. And the agreement is typically pretty brief, like it's, 1,000 words, 800 words. And it basically says, this is what the bank is going to do for the next 5 years. And if you were to boil it down to, a paragraph, it would say the Bank of Canada is going to have its most of its efforts directed at keeping inflation low and stable, and it'll talk about what the target is. It's the CPI, it's 2%, etc. And then the bank just does what it does to achieve that target. And over the course of the year, the governor of the Bank of Canada talks with the Minister of Finance and the Deputy Minister of Finance. They talk about the economy. They share information. There's analysts going on in the Department of Finance. There's lots of analysts going on in the Bank of Canada. But they'll talk, right? But roughly every 6 weeks, there's a fixed announcement date by the Bank of Canada where they announce their interest rate decision. And that decision is the result of a decision made by the governor and the deputy governors, what's called the governing council. Okay. And the finance minister may not like that. And the governor says, well, our monetary policy is directed to keeping inflation low and stable. And for the following, we track what's going on in the economy. And this is what we've decided is the best thing to do this time. And so Tiff Macklin comes out and he announces what they're doing and he announces why, and they have a press release, and every on a regular basis, the governor of the Bank of Canada will appear in a House Finance Committee, and it's kind of full transparency about why the bank did this or why the bank didn't do that. So it is operationally independent, but they talk. fiscal policy in the persona, I suppose, of the minister and the deputy minister of finance. That's fiscal policy. The governor and the deputy governors are monetary policy. They talk, they know each other, they exchange information, but the decision that gets made is getting made by the Bank of Canada. Now, here's the kicker. If the finance minister ever deems that he or she completely disagrees with the decision being made by the governor of the Bank of Canada, the finance minister can issue a directive, okay, in public. So they can say, I'm issuing a directive. I think the minister would stand in the House and issue a directive to the governor of the Bank of Canada. And at that point, right, so why would this ever happen? This would happen only because the minister wants to insist that the governor do something that the governor's not already doing. Mm-hmm. Well, this has never happened, okay? This has never happened. But presumably, if it did happen, the governor would say, well, I'm not going to do that, so I guess I'll resign, okay? And financial markets would blow up and all hell would break loose, and this would not be good. Well, this has never happened. And this is the system we have in Canada after the Coyne affair.
Okay.
So you have heard about the Coyne affair. James Coyne. Yeah. James Coyne was the governor of the Bank of Canada in 1961. The government of the day. So this was the Diefenbaker government of the day. Mm-hmm. Was not very happy with the Bank of Canada, and they wanted the Bank of Canada to do this and this. And the governor said, no, I'm going to do this and this. And finally, they basically announced his position to be vacant, and James Coyne resigned. But because that system didn't exist in place. The system that we have today didn't exist then.
Right.
And my understanding of the story that happened is that they then went to the senior deputy governor of the time, Louis Rasminski, and they said, would you please take over as governor? And Rasminski said, I will take over as governor, but only if you reform the Bank of Canada Act to include this thing that I just described. So this is a system that we now call joint responsibility, that the governor, the bank, is operationally independent, but they are in fact accountable to the government and to Parliament, because ultimately the minister or the prime minister could issue a directive to the bank and to the governor and take responsibility, but that has never happened.
So this is one of these classic Canadian compromises in policy, just like the notwithstanding clause. I love it.
I love it too.
Great.
So whether or not it's the same as the notwithstanding clause, we could probably have a long, debate about that. But I think it's a great system that has been in place in Canada since I think 1967, that reform of the Bank of Canada Act, and it has, that a directive has never been issued, and we've had, operationally independent monetary policy, and especially in the era of inflation targeting, which started in 1991, I suppose. I think monetary policy in this country has been very, very successful.
I love, there's nothing better than a giant emergency button that never has to get pressed. That's excellent. That's perfectly Canadian. I really appreciate that. Okay, so I want to bring this back to the present, because I want to get into the politics of all of this. The penchant of populist politics, particularly on the right now, to target this whole idea of operational independence of the Bank of Canada. We've seen this in Canada as well as we've seen this in the United States with your aforementioned Trump attacks on Powell's independence. So how have the markets responded to the threat of an indictment here? Has there been any response by the markets so far?
I think actually very little, which is mm-hmm. interesting. So I'm not quite sure how to interpret that. I mean, maybe they interpret that as this is, just another bunch of bluster from a president who is now becoming rather common, rather habitual, right? For bluster. So, so I think kind of we're waiting to see. We're waiting to see how far this goes. And also, it's not just about, whether Jerome Powell resigns, and I don't think he will resign, but who he gets replaced with. But at this point, still, I mean, it's so let me just say what the market response could be if the financial markets, participants in financial markets at this point believed that it was very likely that the U.S. Fed would become very expansionary, and that the longer run effect would be inflation. What we would expect to see is U.S. bond prices declining. Bonds are almost all sold in nominal terms. So future inflation, if you expect inflation to be higher, not next year, but let's say 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 6 years from now, if you expect inflation to go up, then all of those bonds look less attractive. So people would sell those bonds, the bond prices would decline, and the yields on those bonds would go up. So the higher interest rate on those bonds would reflect the higher expectation of future inflation. That's
Right.
the market response you'd expect. So for example, if we had woken up, after the Jerome Powell video, if we had woken up and yields on U.S. Bonds had gone up by 50 basis points or 100 basis points, which is a full percentage point, we kind of go, holy smokes, I guess the markets are expecting inflation. But I don't think we've seen that.
So
there's been a pretty...
Stop there, because just for people who maybe aren't as economically literate, can we just explain what yield would mean here?
Sorry, the yield is the rate of return you earn on a bond.
Okay,
If
so
you
the
buy
idea,
it at today's price and then you hold it to maturity. So
Sure.
the yield is the interest rate you earn on a bond.
okay, so
Okay.
say I'm buying a 5-year bond. The cost of my 5-year bond is $10, but I earn back $15 in 5 years, and then the yield on that would be $5.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
So what happens is if you expect inflation, so I think that the easiest way to say this is if financial markets expect inflation to go up from, let's say, a current level of 2% up to 5%, what you'd expect is that those U.S. 2-year, 5-year, 10-year bonds would all of a sudden have yields or interest rates on them that are about 3 percentage points higher than they are today. About 3 percentage points higher is to reflect the 3% higher inflation that people are expecting. But we haven't seen that yet. So maybe this just hasn't run its course yet.
Or maybe people have a lot of confidence in Powell to sort of stand up to this type of intimidation, and that's part of the reason why he issued the video release that he did.
You can have confidence in Powell, but that only lasts while Powell is chair.
Right.
So his term comes to an end in the middle of this year. So now there's a lot of discussion about who will Trump appoint as his successor, and will he appoint some yes man who does, who just lowers interest rates and gooses the economy and then provides that inflationary pressure. So at some point, if markets really do come to believe that Trump will, that this is not just bluster, that Trump will actually replace Powell either soon or in the middle of this year with some, higher inflation kind of guy, until the markets believe that, I guess we're not going to see much of a response. But when they do, then I think you'll see the response quite quickly. If that ever happens. If that happens. But there's a possibility here that this is just Trump bluster, and that Trump will be convinced over the next 6 months to replace Jerome Powell with a sensible person. I mean, that's possible. I'm
just saying, Tucker Carlson for Fed chair is looking real sexy right now for me. So the other question I would say to this sort of less doomer interpretation would be a lot of Trump's attempts to punish his political enemies with inflated court indictments have gone nowhere. James Comey was probably the most obvious example of this. There was a big indictment against him, and the courts just threw it out. But it looks like at least some of the American courts systems are proving resilient to the idea of unitary executive control. And Trump's attempts to prosecute people in order to get his way just isn't going anywhere, at least not yet.
Well, yeah, and that's right. And maybe that's going to, maybe the pushback effectively against Trump is going to increase over time. And so we haven't yet seen the Supreme Court's determination on the legality of the tariffs I think that was supposed to come last week, but now it's been delayed. I'm not quite sure how long that's been delayed.
Could come out tomorrow.
But
You know?
also with all of the Greenland stuff, I mean, maybe that's going to prove to be a bridge too far for Donald Trump, and so maybe you're going to get pushback on that. So I mean, who knows? This is you've really got to be, and all of us are, of course, watching and hearing the news daily, multiple times a day, because this high frequency digestion of news is crucial, because there are things happening, multiple times a day. So we'll wait and see, I suppose, what happens here.
The other question I have, going back to the bond stuff you were mentioning, so one of the first signals of lack of independence of the Fed going forward would be increasing bond yields and declining bond prices.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So does that have a non-virtuous effect on the overall system? And by that, I mean, does the fact that the price of the bonds go down and the yields go up, does that fuel into an inflationary cycle?
Great question. So it doesn't cause inflation itself, right? If what there is inflationary expectation. So let's suppose Fed behavior doesn't change, but people are worried that Fed behavior will change in a year, 2 years, 3 years.
As a result of the Carlson Fed sort of tenure. Yeah.
So there has been no change in Fed policy yet, but there's a belief that inflation will be higher in the future. So bond yields start rising now. These are forward-looking financial markets. So bond yields start rising now in anticipation of that feared future inflation. And then you say, well, what does that do to the economy? Well, if U.S. government bond yields now, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 30-year bond yields go up, but they go up now, let's say by a full percentage point. Well, then typically corporate bond yields are going to go up by that same amount, because corporate bond yields are never lower than government bond yields. The safest issuer of debt out there is the U.S. Treasury. So corporate bonds, corporations borrow at an interest rate higher than what the U.S. government borrows. So if the U.S. government bond yields go up by 1 percentage point, corporate bond yields are going to go up by 1%, maybe even a little bit more. And that means corporations are now having a harder time raising money. So this is actually going to have a negative effect, and the opposite effect of what Donald Trump is looking for. Donald Trump is looking for lower interest rates so that he can get more investment. But the threat of decapitating Jerome Powell, the threat of decapitating effectively the Fed, is that it creates the inflationary expectations that drive up interest rates. They don't drive down interest rates. So actually that will lead to a negative impact on investment. It's exactly the opposite of what Trump wants. And it's bad for the economy. You've got investment now being curtailed because the cost of capital has gone up for private companies.
Or it's possible that what you would potentially see would be a short-term goosing of the economy, so a short-term spree of buying and spending, which would maybe be front-ended as a result of those future inflationary concerns?
I think remember my thought experiment started with, let's suppose Fed policy doesn't change just yet. The short-term goosing of the economy comes if and when the Fed actually changes policy. Okay, so, but what I was trying to explain was, even if the Fed did nothing today, the expectations of future inflation would drive up interest rates. If the Fed actually does start goosing the economy today by lowering short-term interest rates, then you can also get the next thing happening, which is, they start goosing the economy today. That's going to create inflation in the future. So now inflation expectations for the future go up. So now longer-term interest rates go up. So this is a little weird. I just said the Fed is going to lower short-term interest rates, but the impact on that may be to raise longer-term interest rates because of the inflation expectations.
Okay, but
I get excited about this, but you can see why people think monetary policy is a little complicated.
No. This is great, because this feeds into the politics of the conversation. So you're saying Trump's got to replace Powell in the next 6 months. So that takes us into what, July?
Something like that.
July.
I thought it was May, but I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So
May, June, July.
only a few months before the midterms. So the political incentives right now are for Trump to sort of create an environment of fear and intimidation around Powell. Powell gets dumped for some kind of lackey who's going to keep interest rates artificially low in order to create a short-term goosing of the economy heading right into the midterms, which will then summarily collapse by sort of December of next year, if not sooner.
Yeah. So if the Fed,
Okay.
sure. You can replace Jerome Powell in the summer with a person who then cuts interest rates significantly, gooses the U.S. economy in a noticeable way before the midterm elections, and the longer run pain and suffering that comes from the higher inflation is all way down the road, and a short-sighted president or Congress, for that matter, could not care about it.
Great. Yes. So super. That's where my money is. Yes. Perfect. That's great. So, what happens to the rest of the real economy in that period, and how screwed are we in Canada again?
So the effect of these events in the United States on Canada is interesting, and it's hard to predict. So let's imagine what happened is that Trump does his thing, and inflation expectations rise in the United States. And as a result, the bond yields in the United States start to rise. Now, then the question is, what do people think about what's going on in Canada, and how do they react? Well, for now, at least, I think it's reasonable that people would continue to believe that Canadian commitment to low inflation isn't going to go anywhere. And if there is a belief that inflation is going to go up in America, then those people that aren't buying the American bonds and their prices are therefore going down and their yields are going up may then switch their portfolios over and buy more Canadian bonds. And that inflow of financial capital into Canada would actually strengthen the Canadian dollar. Now, some people are going to say, well, that's great. We are better off with a stronger Canadian dollar. But remember that as the Canadian dollar appreciates, that's great if you're importing things into the country, but it's not so good if you're trying to export things outside of the country. So this is exactly why the Bank of Canada, by the way, doesn't target an exchange rate. It targets inflation and then lets the exchange rate go where it wants.
Right.
The problem is, in the story that I just told, is that we don't know exactly what people are going to think. When they think, if they think that American inflation is going to go up, we don't know what they're going to think about what's going on in Canada. We don't know how those financial portfolios will be reallocated either toward Canada or away. So this is just hard to predict.
Fair enough. And I never ask people to make predictions because, especially in this godforsaken year of 2026, no one would have predicted the last 2 weeks. So my last question here, and then I think we do have to wrap it up. Maybe not. Maybe I can get in two questions here. But the first one is all of this just about juicing crypto? Because when we talk about sort of, okay, reducing the economy up front, and then we're going to create larger inflationary risks in the medium term, the people who potentially would benefit from that level of volatility are crypto bros. So the people who are trying to punch things like Bitcoin as the new gold, as a kind of alternative to fiat currency controlled by a central bank. And we know a lot of the crypto and tech bros are pretty in with the Trump administration. So is it possible that that's a motivating cause for all of this?
Well, so look, I don't know much about Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And I'm not a big fan of them. I certainly don't think that they solve much of an interesting problem for society. But if, in fact, the uncertainty about inflation and in currency markets stimulates the demand for cryptocurrency, as it does stimulate the demand for gold, typically in uncertain times, you could build that sort of conspiracy theory that this is all just designed to help the crypto bros. I mean, maybe that's going on, but I'm not going to make that allegation. But also, who knows exactly what the motivation is for what's going on? And this is one of the really hard parts about watching U.S. policy these days and watching Donald Trump is that I find it at least very difficult to figure out what the motivation is, because there doesn't seem to be, at least for me, there doesn't seem to be some coherent philosophy, worldview, whatever, that connects all of these actions. So I don't know.
It's just vibes, man. It's just economic policy by vibes. Last question, and then I will let you go, but I really appreciated your time and I've really enjoyed this conversation. But we've had our own version of this in in Canada. Pierre Poilievre a couple years ago sort of made his attempts to undermine, I believe it was Tiff Macklem at the time, and was making, braying noises about economic independence, the organizational independence of the Bank of Canada. So there does seem to be a common thread here, that there is a sense among the populist right that the central banks can't be trusted, or that central banks fundamentally operate for the benefit of the elites in society. And they must be either brought under, democratic heel, or they must be abolished, or they must be undermined through other alternative forms of currency like crypto anyway. There's something about the entire monetary system that seems fictional,
Yep.
or ununderstandable, or
Yep.
rigged in some way. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
So I think we should have a separate podcast on this conversation. No, because this is a huge issue. So I think you're quite right that there is a bunch of things, right? First of all, very few people, like, I don't know, 1% of the population thinks about financial markets, right? And
1.1 now after this podcast.
But in a subset of that, think about central banks. So there's all kinds of confusion about what central banks do. And if you go on the internet and kind of are looking for theories, conspiracy theories, and the dark secrets about central banking, you will find tons, because it is just it's an attractor for conspiracy theories, and I think it just is feeding on people's basic ignorance of financial markets and central banks. Now, societies have kind of evolved toward modern central banks for a reason. I mean, central banks didn't used to exist. But when you're confronted with financial panics of various kinds, stock market crashes of various kinds, needs to sort of support the economy, I mean, there is a long and interesting history that has ended up with central banks that are owned by governments but are operationally independent as a way of doing a bunch of things. Central banks don't just try to control inflation. They also respond massively when there are financial crises. They also, of course, issue currency. They also, are trying to beat back counterfeiters. In some countries, they are regulating banks, financial institutions. That's different in different countries. So, but there's a huge amount of ignorance about central banks. And you're quite right that there's this populist view, I think, in general, against the elite. And it's pretty hard to find more elite than central banks, right? I mean, they are the elite of the financial sector, and the financial sector themselves are viewed as elite. So it's the elite of the elite. And so it's a natural target. I think all of that is true, but I think it's also true that we, through our democratic governments, have actually evolved central banks to be important institutions that actually play a very important role. And I think we have found a way to make sure that they actually do it responsibly. This is why, back to Canada, we have an agreement every 5 years between the Government of Canada and the Bank of Canada. We have this system of joint responsibility that ensures that the bank doesn't kind of run off on its own and do whatever it wants. It's still accountable to the government. It's accountable to the people through Parliament. But we're also recognizing that politicians are human. And if politicians can get their hands on the levers, the policy levers of a central bank, they will use them to goose the economy before an election. And the long run cost of that is high and volatile inflation. And we found a way to solve that problem. And in Canada, we have solved that problem. In most other countries, they have solved that problem, which is why operational independence is a thing for central banks. And to me, the worst part of this is that the United States is in the middle of, or at the beginning of perhaps, chipping away at that. And so there's a real threat here. And so this is not just politics. This is a huge economic issue. And I understand how in the populist frame, I may be viewed as just an apologist to the elite of the elite. But when you actually get into central banking and you think about monetary policy over time, over space. There's a reason why our central banks behave the way they do.
On the flip side to all of that, money's not even real, man. Sorry, I just did that.
I love money. I love lecturing in economics, and there's a lot of things I like lecturing about. But the idea that money is backed by nothing, no gold, no tangible anything. It is just, its value comes only from the fact that we have confidence in its value. It's the ultimate con game in that sense. I love it. I love it. I love it.
Well, you know what? No economics news is good news. All economics news is bad news. But thank you very much, Professor, for coming in and talking to us and explaining us how money works, how central banks work. You know what? I actually think this has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation, and I've really appreciated your expertise and time. So thanks for coming.
Thank you, Jen. Very happy to help you out, and I hope those people watching find it useful.
Wonderful. Again, and thank you. And do check us out if you haven't already at www.readtheline.ca.